His hands are shaking. It's not a tremor born of the cold, because the night is thick and sticky like a hound's breath. The shaking comes from within, from that hollow place where fear shares a room with certainty. Caleb ties the thick hemp rope around the animal's horns with fingers that have made this gesture thousands of times, yet never with this frantic urgency. A double knot. It has to be secure. It cannot slip. The white steer with the jagged black patches is breathing heavy in the pitch-black barn. Tighten. The animal has eyes that see everything but understand nothing beyond its own agony. They are bloodshot, rimmed with red like someone who spent the night weeping. Caleb presses his palm against the steer's forehead and feels an unnatural heat radiating through the hide. A fever. A burning fever. He whispers something that isn't quite a word. It's the sound a man makes when he loves someone and wishes they didn't have to hurt. Easy, Titan. Easy now. The animal moans. It's not a sound a steer usually makes. It's a sound of deep structural discomfort, of something fundamentally wrong inside that massive white frame. Caleb is 52 years old, and 52 years on a ranch don't leave you guessing about that sound. Caleb first saw death coming when he was 7. It was a milk cow his father kept. He heard that same rattle coming from her throat. He saw his father walk out of the stall with his shoulders slumped. He watched his mother cook the meat the next day in total silence. He watched his father refuse to eat. He never forgot that sound. Titan's groan is identical. Caleb hauls the animal toward the darkest corner of the barn. The floor is hard-packed dirt, compacted by decades of hooves and rain. There is a scent of manure so old and ingrained in the timber that most folks don't even smell it anymore. To Caleb, it's the smell of home, of work, of honor. He grabs an old, tattered tarp, black as the night beyond the open door. He covers the steer. He covers the animal with the same tenderness one would use for a sleeping child, with the kind of delicacy that defines respect. And it's in that exact heartbeat that he hears it. The sound is unmistakable. The roar of heavy-duty pickups approaching the property. Not 1, 2, maybe 3. The tires crunch on the gravel road leading to the barn, and the noise closes in fast, like a predator that finally caught sight of its prey. Caleb falls into absolute silence. His entire body turns to stone. His lungs suddenly become acutely aware of the air they breathe. He knows that sound. He knows exactly who makes it. He knows those black Dodge Rams with the limo-tinted windows belonging to Dr. Sterling. He knows the way they roll onto the land like they own it, because technically they do. He crouches low. He curls into a fetal position beside the covered animal, trying to make himself small enough to vanish inside his own skin. The headlights slash through the barn's darkness like knives through raw meat. 2 blind white beams cut through the open door, scouting every corner of the space, searching for something that's supposed to be lost. Caleb holds his breath. The door is shoved wide open now. The headlights cut out. And in the following silence comes the voice. You know that voice when you hear it. The voice that made you obey for 20 years. The voice that woke you at dawn and sent you home long after dark. The voice that told you that you were efficient, that you were reliable, that you were important. The same voice that always sounds like it's doing you a favor just by speaking. Where's the steer, Caleb? The prize winner that's been missing for 3 days. Dr. Sterling enters the barn like a man walking into his own bedroom. No hesitation, no permission. Because he doesn't need it. He's the owner. Property is a word that means you can do whatever you want with something. And Sterling is very good at doing what he wants. He's 48. The kind of 48 that only comes with deep pockets. Skin tanned by the son of the estate, not by the son of labor. Field clothes that cost more than 3 months of Caleb's salary. Genuine leather boots. A Stetson that looks like it was custom-shaped for his skull. Flanking Sterling, like 2 shadows that decided to stand upright, are his fixers. 2 men with no clear job description other than being beside him. One is named Mark, the other is just the other. Both have the kind of muscle that comes from hurting people, not from working with them. Sterling flips the barn lights on. He doesn't ask for light. He just takes it because in his world, things obey. There is a silence that lasts 3 seconds. 3 seconds is long enough for a man to die of fright. Caleb raises his hands, still huddling on the dirt floor. I don't know, boss. His voice is the sound of a man who just realized he's in much deeper trouble than he thought. The voice of someone who went from hidden to caught without a better lie, ready. Sterling paces through the barn. His steps are slow, deliberate, like he enjoys the rhythm of his own stride. He passes a hanging tool. He passes an empty bucket. He passes a shelf of veterinary supplies that no one uses. And it's in that moment he steps on something. Something that makes a different sound. A sound that is less of a noise and more the death of a fragile object. His boot crushes something on the dirt floor, something that shouldn't be there. Sterling stops. His body goes perfectly still. He lowers his head. His eyes study the ground. He reaches down and picks the object up. It's a syringe, a veterinary syringe with a snapped needle. The plastic barrel is cracked. The plunger is stuck. It's empty, or whatever it carried has already been injected into something that should never have received it. Sterling examines it like a man who just found proof of treason. Because that's exactly what it is. Evidence. A silent confession written in broken plastic. His eyes move from the object to Caleb, and when his eyes meet Caleb's, the whole world seems to shrink. Did you poison him? Sterling's voice is very quiet now, and a quiet voice is much worse than a screaming one, because a quiet voice belongs to someone who has already decided what they're going to do to you, and is just waiting for the right moment to strike. Caleb opens his mouth. The words that come out aren't the right words, but they are the only ones he has. No, doctor. I'm trying to save him, and save everyone who ate the meat from the others. The silence that follows is so deep, it feels like the air itself stopped moving. Sterling looks at Caleb as if he just realized he's talking to a madman. Because in a way, Caleb is. A madman who spent 20 years obeying and is now disobeying. A madman confessing to a crime using nothing but the truth. The fixers exchange looks. Mark moves his hand toward Caleb, but Sterling raises a finger. Just one finger. And that finger is enough to freeze Mark in place. Wait. He walks toward Caleb. His steps are still slow, still deliberate. But now there's something else in them. A curiosity. A desire to understand exactly what kind of madness is happening on his ranch while he sleeps in his mansion. Sit. Caleb collapses to the floor as if someone had cut the strings holding him up. He sits, and Sterling sits too, close enough that Caleb can feel the heat of the man's body. Close enough that it is perfectly clear who has the power and who only has hope. Explain, Sterling says. Explain to me why you poisoned an animal that costs more than your entire life's salary. Caleb breathes. The air in his lungs is the air of a man telling his final story. When you work on a ranch for 20 years, you learn things without anyone teaching you. You learn what a healthy animal looks like. You learn the sound they make when they're sick. You learn to see the changes before they become obvious. Caleb had seen the changes in Titan weeks ago. They weren't big. They were small. An isolation from the rest of the herd. A different way of feeding. A kind of attention that wasn't normal care. 2 weeks ago, Caleb was sweeping near the office. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just sweeping like he did every day. But that day's trash was different. There were empty vials. Vials of medicine Caleb recognized. He found 4 of them. Each one had a label that said cephalosporin. Cephalosporin is an antibiotic that has been around a long time, but the 4th generation kind is special. It's special because it's reserved for human infections that no other antibiotic can kill. It's special because it's expensive. It's special because it's illegal to use on livestock in such a reckless way. Caleb took the vials to his son. His son has internet access. He has the education Caleb never got. His son researched it. What he found was worse than any poisoning. 4th generation cephalosporin used indiscriminately in animals creates superbugs, not in one animal, but in many. These superbugs are resistant to every known antibiotic, and when you eat the meat of an animal carrying these superbugs, they enter you. If those bacteria get inside you and you catch an infection, any infection, no antibiotic in the world will kill it. The infection kills you. Caleb looks at Sterling when he says this part, looks him right in the eye. Because it's important Sterling understands he isn't lying, that he's telling the truth as he sees it. I dug deeper, Caleb continues. You know why the animals were vanishing at night? Why there was that unregistered refrigerated truck? Why the antibiotic vials were always empty? Caleb pauses. Because the next part is what will destroy everything. Because you were testing these animals. You were injecting them with massive doses. You were watching the reaction. You were creating a protocol to fatten them up fast using a drug you knew was banned. And when the animals started showing symptoms of the infection, you shipped them to the slaughterhouse and sold the meat. Titan isn't just a prize steer, doctor. Titan is a guinea pig. You're testing a protocol on him that you're going to use on the whole herd." Sterling doesn't move. He doesn't blink. He remains absolutely still, as if he had died and no one told his body. When he finally speaks, his voice is even quieter than before. "And the veterinarian who signed the prescriptions?" he asks. Caleb shakes his head. "There were no prescriptions, doctor. You did the injections yourself." Sterling stands up. He walks to the black tarp covering Titan. He lifts the corner. The animal underneath isn't the Titan Caleb once knew. Titan is now an animal lying on his side. Titan is breathing irregularly. There is a scent coming off him that isn't exactly the smell of death, but it's close. It's the smell of something decomposing while it's still alive. Sterling sees the marks, the tracks of recent injections on the animal's flanks. Dozens of them, so close together they look like a pattern, a deliberate pattern, a planned pattern. He turns to his fixers. His expression shifts completely. What was there before was a mask. Caleb now sees what's underneath. He's furious. He's terrified. He's thinking about how many people ate the meat from the animals he sold. He's thinking about how this could destroy everything he built. He's thinking about how someone could check if the meat he sold has superbugs. He's thinking about how he can deny involvement when there's a foreman who knows exactly what happened. It's sickening to see someone use 20 years of trust to risk thousands of lives just to make a few $1,000s more, isn't it? If you also think justice should come, that someone like Sterling should answer for what he did, leave a like now to support Caleb and everyone who was unfairly put at risk. Sterling walks toward Caleb. His hands are balled into fists. His eyes are full of a rage so visceral, so absolutely raw, that Caleb realizes he's looking at a man who sees himself in ruins. "You," Sterling says, his voice shaking now. "You who worked for me for 20 years. You who I gave a job, who I gave dignity." He doesn't finish the sentence, because he realized something in that moment. He realized he had no power over Caleb exactly because Caleb now realized he was right. That Caleb had done the right thing. All Sterling could do was hit a man who was right, and hitting a man who is right is the ultimate weakness. "Mark," Sterling says, "tie Caleb up. Put him in a room. Figure out how we're going to solve this." Caleb offers no resistance. He is hauled into the ranch house and locked in a room that smells of mildew and hopelessness. The door is slammed shut. The key turns in the lock, and Caleb, for the first time in 20 years, understands that he is no longer a free man on this property. He is a prisoner. Outside in the barn, Sterling examines Titan. He examines the animal he planned to sell for a sum that would have expanded his business. He examines the animal that is now living proof of a crime he couldn't deny. He thinks of one thing more important than Titan, more important than Caleb, more important than the truth. He thinks of how to make sure no one finds out, because the truth, when it's the wrong truth for the wrong person, can destroy everything. And Sterling had no intention of letting it all be destroyed over an old man who believed in doing things the right way. Not today, not ever. The rest of the story follows the same logic of localization. Tiao becomes Caleb, Renato becomes Sterling, Marcelo remains Mark, Brasilia Interior becomes a U.S. Heartland Ranch, and the Federal Police Sanitary Surveillance becomes USDA, FDA, FBI federal agents. Caleb doesn't sleep. Not because he chooses not to, but because his body won't allow it. The room where he's locked has a tiny window that doesn't open, just an iron grate letting in stagnant hot air. He sits on the edge of an old mattress that smells like it absorbed the despair of decades. He thinks of Titan. He thinks of all the people who ate the meat. He thinks of a child eating a burger at home, unaware. He thinks of an old man eating beef stew for lunch and then catching an infection no doctor can cure. He thinks of death, invisible death entering through the mouth as food. In the morning, the door opens. It's Mark. Mark has the kind of face made to be near Sterling. A face that doesn't question. A face that only obeys. He drops a tray of food on the floor without a word. He leaves. Caleb doesn't eat. His body asks for food, but his mind won't let him. His heart says, "You don't deserve to eat while Titan is suffering." By afternoon, Caleb hears voices. Voices from outside. Voices that aren't Sterling's. Voices with that tone of authority that comes from government officials. Caleb rushes to the small window and presses his face against the grate. Down there at the ranch entrance are two men in gray uniforms. USDA inspectors. One carries a clipboard. The other has a badge that glints in the mid-afternoon sun. Caleb's heart races. He had made the anonymous call the day before. He had waited at a gas station in town, at a payphone where no one could track him. He had said exactly what needed to be said, that a property was using banned antibiotics, that meat was being sold contaminated, that there was a large-scale health risk. And here they were, the inspectors. Salvation. But then he sees something that makes his heart slow down. He sees Sterling walking out of the big house. He sees Sterling walking toward the inspectors with that smile made of teeth and confidence. He sees Sterling putting his hands on their shoulders like they were old friends he hadn't seen in years. He sees Sterling saying something that makes the inspectors laugh. Caleb pries the small window a bit more, trying to hear. He catches only fragments. Full documentation, healthy stock, quality testing. Sterling is showing papers. Papers that look official. Papers with seals and signatures. Papers Caleb knows are forged, but look completely real because they were made to. Sterling walks with them to the barn. He lets them in. He lets them see. The inspectors walk among the animals, ask questions. Sterling answers with a calm that is terrifying. Caleb wants to scream. He wants to bang on the window. He wants to tell the inspectors to check the cabinets, look for the empty vials, look for Titan, look for the truth. But he knows no one will hear him. The inspectors leave the barn an hour later. Caleb watches their faces. They aren't worried. They don't look suspicious, they look satisfied. Then comes the part that hurts most. Sterling invites the two inspectors to stay for lunch. He insists on grilling for them personally. The inspectors exchange looks. Caleb can see the exact moment they decide to accept. He can see the moment their loyalty becomes something that can be bought with a good steak and a cold beer. They walk together toward the big house. One of the inspectors puts a hand on Sterling's back, like they're buddies. As if Sterling isn't poisoning people. As if Caleb isn't locked in a room right above them. Caleb sits back on the old mattress. He presses his palms against his eyes. He feels the heat of the tears before he feels the moisture. The body weeps before the mind understands there is something to cry about. He sits there for hours, listening to the silence of the house, watching afternoon turn to night, hearing Sterling and the inspectors laughing somewhere downstairs, their voices loud, drunk, and satisfied. At night, after the inspectors leave, Caleb hears Sterling on the phone. His voice comes through the thin walls. It's a monologue of a man very pleased with himself. Another one solved with a barbecue. What a joke. These guys are as easy to control as my cattle. Just give them food and they do what you want. Caleb listens to every word. He listens and feels something inside him shift. It's not rage exactly. It's the death of a hope he didn't even know he had. He thought the truth mattered. He thought if you told the truth to the right people, things would change. He thought there was a system. A broken system maybe, but still a system. Now he understands the system is just an illusion, that the truth can knock on the inspector's door and they choose not to hear. That money is a much more universal language than the truth. The next day, Caleb is released from the room. Sterling calls him in for a talk. His voice is calm, it's even kind, which makes Caleb even more afraid. Caleb, Sterling says, you worked well for 20 years, you were a good foreman, but now you're a problem. And problems need to be solved. Sterling is sitting in a leather armchair that costs more than Caleb's entire house. He's holding a glass of scotch reflecting the late afternoon light. Titan is being sent to the processing plant tomorrow, Sterling continues, along with a lot of other stock that isn't producing anymore. It's the natural cycle of business. Old or sick animals are discarded. Good meat is sold, money is made. He takes a sip of scotch. You can stay here if you want to keep working like before. No questions, no reports, no trying to be a hero. Caleb opens his mouth to speak. Sterling raises a hand. Or you can leave. You can look for another job somewhere else. You can try to tell your story to anyone who will listen. You can try to be a hero to someone who doesn't give a damn. Sterling smiles. But if you choose the second option, Caleb, you know I won't let you leave with a recommendation. You know I'll tell every rancher in the county that you stole, that you're untrustworthy. You know no one will hire a traitor. The silence that follows is the silence of a crossroads. Caleb understands he's being offered a choice between two paths that both lead to hell, just at different speeds. If he stays, he dies of a guilty conscience watching Titan turn into contaminated meat. If he leaves, he starves because no one will hire a man who betrayed his boss. Sterling knows this. That's why he's smiling. You have until dawn to decide, Sterling says, turning back to his scotch. Caleb leaves the room. He walks the entire property in a state that isn't quite thinking. His feet walk, His eyes see, but the rest of him is numb. He passes the barn. He passes the corral. He passes every corner of the ranch he's known for 20 years. Every corner is a hoard of memories. Every corner is a place where he helped Sterling get rich. And in none of those places is he seen as human. Night falls completely. Caleb is sitting under a tree near the barn where Titan remains. He thinks of his daughter. He thinks of how she invited him to live with her in St. Louis. He thinks of how he refused because he thought he had a life here. A life that mattered. Now he understands his life doesn't matter to Sterling. Titan's life doesn't matter. The life of no child who will eat that contaminated meat matters. The only thing that matters is the money. Caleb stands up. He walks to the barn. He opens the door. Titan is there. The animal is worse than yesterday. His breathing is more irregular. His eyes are even more glazed. The fever keeps burning that white and spotted body. Caleb puts his hand on the animal's head. "I'm sorry," he whispers. "I'm sorry for not being strong enough. I'm sorry for trying to do the right thing and failing." Titan doesn't answer. He can't. He can't do anything but breathe and suffer. Caleb wipes the tears from his face with the back of his hand. He feels the decision taking shape in his mind. It's not a decision he chose. It's a decision Sterling forced on him through the weight of impossible options. He's going to take Titan. He's going to get the animal out of here. He's going to hide him somewhere Sterling can't find him. He's going to try to save him. It might not work. It probably won't work, but at least he'll try. He finds an old lead rope on a nail. He loops it around Titan's neck. The animal is too weak to resist. He's just letting himself be led. Caleb remembers there's an abandoned shack in the woods a few miles from the property. A place Sterling doesn't use. A place so far away Sterling probably doesn't even remember it exists. He pulls the animal slowly. Titan walks. His hooves thud on the dirt. Every step feels like it will be the last. But the animal keeps walking, because there's still something inside him that wants to live. It takes hours to get there. Caleb pulling. Titan walking slowly. The night around them pitch black beyond the flashlight Caleb carries. When they reach the shack, Caleb puts the animal inside. He puts water in a bucket. He puts hay on the floor. It's too little. It's not enough. But it's what he has. Titan lies down. His body thuds against the rotting wood floor. Caleb sits beside the animal. He puts his hand on his flank. He feels the racing heart. He feels the burning fever. He needs medication. He needs something to kill the superbugs. He needs a way to make Titan's body fight what's inside him. Caleb spends the whole night thinking. Thinking of Mark. Thinking of how Mark is lazy. Thinking of how Mark always falls asleep after he eats. Thinking of how the medicine cabinet is in the room next to Mark's quarters. In the morning, Caleb returns to the ranch. No one sees him. He enters through the back gate. He walks like he's still an employee, as if he still has a right to be there. Mark is in the kitchen eating. Caleb passes right by him, goes down the hall, opens the medicine cabinet. There are the vials, some of the antibiotics Sterling uses. They aren't the fourth-generation ones. Sterling wouldn't leave those in plain sight. But there's something that might help. Caleb grabs 3 vials. He puts them in a cloth bag. It's in that moment he hears the footsteps. Footsteps coming down the hall. Footsteps approaching fast. Caleb turns. He sees Mark standing at the end of the hall. He sees the realization crossing Mark's face. He sees that Mark understands Caleb is stealing. Caleb doesn't think. He just runs. He busts through the kitchen door. He crosses the yard. He runs toward the corral. He runs past the animals that haven't been sent to the plant yet. He hears Mark shouting behind him. Caleb runs faster. His heart is racing too much. His body is too tired. But he keeps running, because he knows if Mark catches him, it's all over. Titan dies. The contaminated meat is sold. People eat. People die. He manages to knock his cap off his head as he runs. He manages to run into the woods. He manages to vanish among the trees. Behind him, Mark stops, panting, furious, holding something. Caleb turns his head as he runs and sees what Mark is holding. It's his cap. His old cap with his initials stitched on. The cap that fell during the run. The cap that is a silent confession that Caleb was there. He knows Mark will take it to Sterling. He knows Sterling will know he took Titan. He knows there is now only one way this ends. Either Caleb saves Titan in the next few days, or Titan dies. And when he dies, Caleb dies too. Because no one takes an animal of Sterling's and leaves the property alive. The abandoned shack becomes Caleb's whole world, not because he chose it, but because choices are a luxury he no longer has. For 2 days he stays there with Titan, administering the stolen antibiotics, changing the water the animal drinks, cleaning the filth from the rotting wood floor. The work is physically exhausting. The work is spiritually devastating. Titan gets worse. Not slowly, consistently, and terrifyingly. The fever spikes. The eyes close more. The animal's movements become slower and slower. Caleb can count every rib through the white and spotted hide. The steer is turning into a living skeleton. On the night of the second day, Caleb faces a truth he had avoided. He can't save Titan alone. He needs help. He needs someone with knowledge. He needs someone who can draw a tissue sample from the animal, a sample that proves the bacterial contamination, an irrefutable proof. He thinks of Dr. Vance. Vance is a retired vet who lived near Sterling's property before walking away from it all. Caleb had known Vance for many years. He knew him because Sterling frequently called Vance to examine the stock. He knew him because Vance always had that look of someone who sees more than he's allowed to say. Caleb leaves Titan in the shack. He leaves enough water, he leaves hay, he leaves a prayer he doesn't finish because he doesn't believe in God enough to pray fully. He walks to town. The distance is nearly 10 miles. His feet are blistered inside boots not made for such treks. His body is tired beyond any reasonable limit. His mind is trapped on a single question. Will Vance help? Vance lives in a small house on the edge of town. A house with plants on the porch. A house with a sign that says, Veterinary Home Visits. A house with an old man sitting in a front rocking chair, watching the world go by. Caleb knocks on the door. Vance opens it. It takes his eyes a second to recognize Caleb. It takes another second to understand that something is very wrong. Because Caleb isn't a man who shows up at retired vets' houses looking the way he looks right then. Caleb is a man covered in mud and sweat and despair. Caleb, Vance says. What happened? Caleb enters uninvited. He sits. He starts telling. He tells about the antibiotics. He tells about the superbugs. He tells about Titan. He tells about Sterling. He tells about the inspectors who can be bought with a barbecue. Vance listens without interrupting. He just listens. And when Caleb finishes, Vance stays silent for a time that feels like hours. Do you know what you're asking? Vance finally asks. I do, Caleb replies. I'm asking you to help me convict the man who was your client for 20 years. Vance stands up. He walks to the window, looks at the street. Sterling offered me a lot of money over the years, Vance says. Money to turn a blind eye to things I saw. Money to not ask questions. Money to be an accomplice. He turns to Caleb. I always refused, he continues. I always said I had professional ethics, principles, that a vet couldn't just ignore animal abuse and food contamination. Vance takes a deep breath. But I also always ignored it, because ignoring is easier than confronting, because fear is stronger than principles when you live in the same county as the man you want to report. He walks over to Caleb. If I take a sample from Titan, if I take that sample to an independent lab, if I tell the truth about what's in there, Sterling will destroy me. He'll say I'm an incompetent vet. He'll say I'm lying out of spite. He'll make sure no one ever hires me again. Vance sits down again. But maybe it's time to be destroyed. Maybe it's time to do the right thing, even if the right thing costs me everything. He reaches out his hand to Caleb. Take me to the animal. We'll do this together. Caleb feels something inside him that isn't exactly relief, but close. It's the feeling that he isn't alone. The feeling that there's another person willing to fall with him. They walk to the abandoned shack. Vance brings a bag of instruments. He brings collection vials. He brings a way to turn Titan into scientific evidence. When they arrive, Titan is still alive, but only technically. The animal is lying down. He doesn't get up when he sees Caleb. He doesn't respond when Vance examines him. Vance works fast. He draws a muscle tissue sample. He draws blood. He puts everything in sterile vials. He labels them. He records the time and date. Done, Vance says. Now we need to get this to a lab with no connection to Sterling. A state lab. A lab that can run the right tests and has credibility. Caleb and Vance leave the shack. Vance has his car parked a few miles away on a back road near the property. They walk to the car. Vance carefully places the samples on the back seat. He sits in the front. He puts the key in the ignition. It's in that moment another car appears. It comes around a bend. It comes fast. It comes like it's been waiting. Mark is inside the car. Mark and 3 more men Caleb had never seen before. Big men with the faces of people used to doing what they're told. Vance's car is blocked. Mark gets out. He walks to Vance's window. He knocks. Vance doesn't open. Mark knocks again. Harder this time. Vance rolls the window down. Just a crack. "Need something?" Vance asks, his voice shaking. "Your samples," Mark says. "What's in those vials?" "Nothing that concerns you," Vance replies. Mark opens the car door with a swift motion. He hauls Vance out. The vet falls against the hot asphalt of the road. The 3 men get in the car. One grabs the vials. He puts them in a plastic bag. He gets out. Mark stands over Vance. His boot is near the vet's face. "Dr. Vance," Mark says in a very calm voice, "you shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be stealing biological samples from animals that don't belong to you. You shouldn't be helping people like this one." Mark points to Caleb, frozen on the other side of the car. "What's going to happen is this. You're going to stop being alive in a few minutes if you stay on this path. You're going to have a car accident. You're going to hit a tree, hit it real hard. No one will find it strange because you're an old man. Old men have accidents." Mark pauses. "Or you can live. You can forget you saw Caleb. You can forget you saw the steer. You can go back to your house and your rocking chair and your quiet life. You can leave things as they are. Which is it, doctor?" Vance doesn't speak. He just breathes. "What's your choice, Doc?" Vance doesn't answer with words. He just raises his hands in submission. Mark smiles. That kind of smile made of victory and contempt. "Good. Leave Caleb here too. You go. You forget everything. If we hear you told anyone anything, we'll be back, and next time we won't be talking." Vance stands up. He looks at Caleb for a moment that lasts 3 seconds. In Vance's eyes is a plea for forgiveness that can't be said out loud. Then he gets in the car. Driving alone, with the car damaged in front from Sterling's men who rammed him, he leaves. Caleb is left alone with Mark and his men. Mark is laughing now. He's laughing because he won. He's laughing because the old vet gave up before he could do any damage. He's laughing because Sterling always wins. "We're going to find where you're keeping the steer," Mark says. "Might be tomorrow, might be next week, but we're going to find it. And when we do, you understand it won't be pretty, right?" Mark claps Caleb on the back, as if they were friends. "Go back there. Stay with your steer. Enjoy these last few days, because you won't have many." Mark's men grab Caleb. They shove him onto the road. The car pulls away in a cloud of dust. Caleb sits on the hot asphalt. His eyes follow the car until it vanishes. He feels the pain of being shoved. He feels the pain of being totally alone again. The evidence is gone. Vance is gone. Everything is gone. He walks back to the shack. It takes nearly 3 hours. His feet leave marks on the damp earth. His body works only by inertia. When he reaches the shack, Titan is breathing, but barely. The fever stayed during the time Caleb was gone. The animal has deteriorated dramatically. Caleb knows the animal won't last much longer. He knows in a day or 2, Titan will be dead. He knows all this struggle, all this pain, all this sacrifice was for nothing. That night, Caleb doesn't sleep. He sits beside Titan, putting cold compresses on the animal's head, changing the water bucket, saying things the animal can no longer hear. On the morning of the 3rd day, Caleb hears something that makes his spine turn to ice. The sound of tracking dogs. The sound of coordinated men's voices. The sound of someone searching for something lost. Caleb positions himself at the shack's small window. He sees on a distant hill a pickup with men standing in the bed. He sees drones in the air. He sees the organized, systematic search. Sterling isn't just looking for Titan. Sterling is looking for Caleb. Sterling wants his animal back. He wants to silence the witness. He wants to return to the normal life where he can poison people without complaint. The dogs start to close in. Caleb can hear them now, barking, the sound of animals that caught a scent. He thinks for only 2 seconds. Then he acts. He creates a crude trap near the shack. He puts sticks in tree roots. He creates an illusion of a path leading one way while Titan stays hidden in another. The dogs arrive. They sniff. They follow the trap Caleb made. They get lost on the wrong path. Caleb takes that time. He carries Titan, literally hauling the animal that now weighs like a heavy shadow, toward a swampy marsh he remembered from the property map. They enter the marsh. The mud reaches Caleb's waist. Titan almost drowns, but Caleb holds him up. The animal floats more than he walks. Behind them, Caleb can hear the men approaching. He can hear the confusion when they realize they were tricked. He can hear them deciding to change direction. Caleb and Titan keep through the marsh. Every step is a fight. Caleb's body can't take anymore. His lungs are burning. His legs are aching. But he keeps going. Finally, he comes out of the marsh. He comes out in a dense thicket Sterling probably doesn't even know exists. Caleb creates a new hiding spot. He puts Titan in a small natural shelter between rocks. He covers it with foliage. When he moves far enough away to confirm it's not visible, he sits on a rock. He sits and just stays there, breathing, trembling, weeping without making a sound. Titan managed to escape alive, but barely. The infection has spread. Caleb can see it. The wound on the animal's hoof is now necrotic. The smell coming from there is the smell of death coming slowly. Titan's body is starting to eat itself from the inside out. Caleb knows the animal is suffering. He knows Titan is in a pain that is impossible to describe. He knows no medicine will work anymore. He knows all Titan wants now is to stop hurting. That night, Caleb walks to a place on the old property he knew since he was young. A place where Sterling kept tools. A place where there was a captive bolt pistol. A bolt pistol is an old tool. It's made to kill cattle instantly. It's made to be fast, efficient, without suffering. Caleb carries it to Titan. The animal is lying down. His eyes are open but empty. His breathing irregular, suffering painted in every curve of his body. Caleb puts the barrel of the pistol against the steer's forehead. His hand is shaking so much he thinks it will explode. He's thinking of ending Titan's suffering. He's thinking of letting the animal rest. He's thinking how no living being deserves to suffer the way Titan is suffering. His finger moves toward the trigger, but then he thinks of something else. If Titan dies now, he dies as a common animal. He dies without a witness. He dies without proof. He dies without anyone knowing what Sterling did. If Titan dies now, Sterling wins completely. It's not just the death of the animal, it's the death of the truth. Caleb lowers the pistol. He sets the weapon on the ground. He puts his head to Titan's muzzle. He whispers promises he doesn't know if he can keep. Hold on, Titan. Hold on one more day. Hold on long enough for someone to find out what you are. Hold on long enough to be proof. The animal doesn't answer. He just keeps suffering. And Caleb, in that moment, understands that maybe he is more cruel keeping Titan alive than he would be putting a bolt in the steer's head. He understands that maybe there is no right path. Only wrong paths you choose because they're less wrong than the others. He understands that sometimes in real life there is no victory, only survival, only the refusal to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. He stays there all night, holding a bolt pistol, pointing at the head of an animal that should have been dead days ago, waiting for a miracle. Or death, whichever comes first. The night is so black there is no difference between eyes open or shut. Caleb is lying on the ground near Titan, the bolt pistol hanging from his hand like a weight he can't drop. His mind doesn't work anymore, his body can't take anymore. There is only Titan breathing irregularly and Caleb breathing more irregularly still. It's in that moment he hears the sound, not the sound of dogs, not the sound of fixers shouting. It's the sound of a diesel engine approaching. An engine that runs well. An engine belonging to a vehicle that was maintained properly. Caleb stands up. He runs to the entrance of the hiding spot. He sees through the darkness the headlights of a pickup approaching slowly through the marsh. He thinks for a second Sterling found him. That it's all over. That Caleb will be discovered and everything he did will have been in vain. But the pickup stops at a safe distance. And from inside steps a woman. She doesn't look like she knows exactly where she is. She's reading a map on her phone. She has the look of someone searching and finally finding. She wears a jacket with the Department of Health crest stitched on the chest. "Dr. Helena," the woman says aloud, as if announcing an important arrival. "Epidemiologist from the CDC, I'm a friend." Behind her, 2 federal marshals step down, both in uniform, both with badges that mean they work for the government. Caleb can't believe he's seeing this. He can't believe there are people he doesn't know who came to help him. The reality he had accepted was the reality where no one helped, where everything was corruption, where there was no hope, but here it is. Hope, in a department jacket. "Caleb, are you Caleb?" Dr. Helena asks. "Yes," Caleb replies, and in that moment, his voice breaks. The voice that had been firm for days disintegrates into a single word. Dr. Helena walks to Titan. She examines the animal with the look of someone who knows exactly what they're searching for. She touches the hoof wound, looks into the steer's eyes, places a stethoscope on the animal's lungs. When she finishes, her face is different. It's the face of someone who understands they were seeing something much worse than predicted. It's a multi-drug resistant superbug, she tells the agents. Likely KPC or NDM. The animal should have been dead days ago. She turns to Caleb. How long have you kept this steer alive? 3 days, Caleb replies, since I found out what Sterling was doing. Dr. Helena sits on a rock. She takes her hat off. She runs her hand through her hair like someone processing something much bigger. Do you know why you're here? She asks. Do you know why you risked your life to protect an animal? Caleb opens his mouth to answer, but Dr. Helena continues. You don't know yet, but you will. And when you do, you'll understand this steer isn't just a steer. This steer is evidence of a crime so large it's going to make Sterling vanish from the face of the earth. Dr. Helena pulls a tablet from her pocket. She shows Caleb data, names, information. Dr. Sterling is the majority shareholder in 5 private hospitals in this region. She begins. 5 very profitable hospitals. 5 hospitals serving patients from every socio-economic level, but specifically serving the poor. She swipes the screen. In the last 3 years, there's been a 240% increase in admissions related to hospital infections in your region. Infections that don't respond to known antibiotics. Infections that turn a simple cut into a slow death. Caleb still doesn't grasp the connection. Dr. Helena takes a deep breath. His hospitals treat these infections with experimental drugs, with incredibly expensive procedures, with treatments lasting months. Patients spend their entire life savings. Families are ruined. People die anyway. She turns the tablet toward Caleb. But Sterling gets very rich, because while people die, his hospitals rake it in. The silence that follows is so deep Caleb can hear his own blood in his veins. You mean? Caleb begins. I mean, Dr. Sterling isn't just selling contaminated meat for petty greed. Dr. Helena interrupts. He's intentionally creating untreatable hospital infections. He's putting superbugs into the food chain. He's contaminating poor people who buy cheap meat at public markets. She stands up. And when those people get sick, when the infections start to go gangrenous, when there are no more antibiotics that work, they go to his hospitals. And there, they pay. Or their families pay. Or they die paying. Caleb feels the ground vanish under his feet. It's not a physical feeling. It's the feeling of understanding he was wrong about the size of the problem. That the problem is much bigger. That the evil is much more organized. That was why the retired vet contacted me, Dr. Helena continues. He was afraid, but he was more afraid of the guilt of staying silent. He sent me an anonymous email with partial data, information on the ranch, information on Sterling. Caleb wants to say something but can't. Are you understanding? Doctor, Helena asks, putting her hands on Caleb's shoulders. You weren't just hiding a steer. You were holding the living proof of an economic genocide. It's in that moment Caleb hears it. The sound of another engine, not as well maintained as Dr. Helena's, more aggressive, more furious. Dr. Helena and the 2 marshals turn. Coming through the marsh at high speed are 2 black pickups, both with limo tint, both recognizable as Sterling's vehicles. Dr. Helena gathers the agents around her. They're monitoring police radio frequencies, she tells the marshals. They know we're here. The pickups reach the spot the way predators arrive, fast, deliberate, with no intention of negotiating. Mark gets out of the first one. Sterling gets out of the second. Sterling has that look Caleb had never seen before. The look of someone whose empire is collapsing. The look of someone who knows exactly what they're going to lose. He walks toward Dr. Helena. This is private property, Sterling says. You're trespassing on private land. You don't have a search warrant. Dr. Helena shows a document. Federal warrant to investigate food contamination with multi-resistant pathogens, she says. Signed by a federal judge, valid nationwide. Sterling takes the paper, reads. His face turns paler with every line. This is an animal intentionally contaminated with banned antibiotics, Dr. Helena continues. This animal is physical evidence of a crime. We're taking it for forensic testing. Sterling rips the paper up. This animal is mine. He's not going anywhere. He signals Mark. Mark and the other fixers start advancing toward Titan. The 2 marshals step in front of the animal. You can't do this, one says. I sure as hell can, Mark replies, walking straight toward them. It's in that moment everything explodes. It's not a literal explosion. It's an explosion of movement, an explosion of bodies clashing, an explosion of different wills trying to occupy the same space. The marshals shove Mark back. Mark shoves forward. The fixers in the back advance. The marshals draw telescoping batons. Chaos takes over the marsh. Caleb is in the middle of it all, in front of Titan, protecting the animal with his own body. Dr. Helena is shouting at the marshals not to use excessive force. She's shouting at Sterling that he's committing a federal crime. She's shouting while pulling Caleb back. Sterling, seeing the situation slip from his hands, does something Caleb didn't expect. He draws a weapon, not a big gun, a pistol, simple, functional, much like the bolt pistol Caleb is still carrying. Sterling points the gun at Titan. If this animal leaves here, he dies here. Dr. Helena stops shouting. The marshals stop fighting. Mark stops advancing. Everything is frozen around a man, a gun, and an animal that should have been dead for days. You're not going to do that, Doctor, Helena says, her voice very calm now. I am, Sterling replies. No property leaves here alive. No witness that anyone can convince to stay quiet. His finger moves toward the trigger. It's in that instant Caleb moves. It's not a thought-out movement. It's a movement coming from somewhere inside him that isn't rational. A movement of protection. A movement to put his body between Sterling and Titan. The gun fires. The sound is absolute. It's the sound of everything changing. It's the sound that makes all of reality reorganize into a before and after. Caleb feels the impact. He feels as if someone had placed something hot inside his shoulder. He feels as if someone had ripped a piece of him away. He feels blood starting to flow. He falls to his knees. The two marshals move simultaneously. One points a gun at Sterling, shouts for him to drop the weapon. The other is placing a compress on Caleb's shoulder. Sterling is still holding the gun, still aiming at Titan, but now there's a federal weapon pointed at his head. Dr. Sterling, the marshal says calmly, you just shot a citizen in front of federal witnesses. You've committed attempted murder. You're done. Sterling looks at the gun, looks at Caleb bleeding, looks at Dr. Helena photographing Titan with her phone as evidence, looks at his fixers now being contained by the agents. And he understands. He understands he lost. That everything he built for 3 decades is going to vanish in a few hours. That his freedom is gone. That his wealth means nothing when you're being convicted of planned murder. Sterling lowers the gun, sets it on the ground, puts his hands on his head. Caleb, still on his knees, still bleeding, still alive, sees that image. He sees the man who terrified him for 20 years surrendering. He sees and feels something inside him that isn't exactly relief. It's the feeling that the impossible happened, that the truth won, that evil was exposed, that Titan, this animal about to be sacrificed, this animal suffering without fault, became the symbol of an entire system of corruption collapsing. Dr. Helena runs to Caleb, wraps her hands around the shoulder wound. You're going to be okay, she says. You were very brave. Caleb looks at Titan. The animal is still standing, though barely. His eyes remain glazed, but now there's hope in them. Now there's the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he survives. The marshals put Sterling in the back of one of the pickups. They put the fixers in another. The scene that was supposed to be an epic battle becomes a parade of defeat. Sterling, sitting back there, looks at Caleb one last time. You won, he says, his voice so quiet only Caleb can hear. You destroyed everything I built for 30 years. Caleb doesn't answer with words. He just holds the compress to his shoulder. He just stays standing, still bleeding, but standing. Because standing when you should be down is the greatest victory a man can have. Dr. Helena is already making calls, calling an ambulance for Caleb, calling a special biocontainment transport for Titan, calling for the federal record. The night that began as the night of death becomes the night of birth. Not the birth of false hope, but the birth of the real possibility that maybe, just maybe, the truth can win even when power says no. Even when money says no. Even when everything indicates winning is impossible. It can be possible. If someone is willing to bleed to make it happen. The ambulance takes Caleb from the marsh with sirens blaring. It takes Titan in a special bio-isolation transport. And it takes the truth no one expected to find that night. Sterling's arrest is documented. The fixers are taken separately. Federal warrants are served in parallel. No part of the scheme is left out. There is no escape because the government machine, once in motion, doesn't stop until it consumes everything pointed out. In the following days, the press discovers the story. Not the story Caleb wanted to tell. It's the story Dr. Helena allows to be told. The story of an economic genocide. The story of a man who turned a region's health into a profit machine. When Caleb leaves the hospital, shoulder bandaged, movement limited, with pain that will follow him for the rest of his life, he turns his back on the property where he worked for 20 years. He knows he can't go back there. He knows the property isn't his anymore. He knows Sterling is still alive, still in jail, but still exists. And as long as he exists, that place will be tainted. The FBI summons him for questioning. Caleb enters a room that is gray and cold. There are two federal investigators, both with the look of people who've seen a lot, but not this. Not like this. You hid material evidence, one says. You stole medication. You sabotaged private property. Yes, Caleb replies. Why? The other asks. Because it was the right thing to do, Caleb says. The investigators exchange looks. The kind of look that's almost invisible unless you're looking for it. The kind of look that says, this man tells the truth in a way that's hard to process in a system used to sophisticated lies. Do you know you could be prosecuted for this? The first asks. Yes, Caleb replies. But if I hadn't done it, no one would ever know. Titan would have died. Contaminated meat would have kept being sold. People would keep getting sick. Sterling's hospitals would keep killing people while he got rich. Another look. Another silence. You can go, the investigator says. You'll be a star witness in the trial. You won't be prosecuted for the actions you took. Caleb stands up. His legs are still weak. His body is still healing. And Titan? He asks. There is a silence that isn't exactly uncomfortable, but heavy. The animal didn't make it, the investigator says finally. The infection was too advanced. The federal vets tried everything possible, but the damage was already done. Caleb had never planned for this moment. He had planned for Titan alive. He had planned for the animal to become living proof. He had planned to save the steer, but he hadn't planned for death. In that moment, Caleb understands the animal was always a metaphor. That Titan was never about Titan. Titan was about the truth. And the truth sometimes kills before it can save. He leaves the room. The media wants him. Wants the story of the man who saved thousands of lives. Wants photos, interviews. Wants to turn him into a hero in a way that would make him vanish again. Caleb refuses it all. He grants only one interview to Dr. Helena. Because she understands this isn't about Caleb. It's about the steer. It's about the silence that kills. You had other choices, Dr. Helena says in the interview. You could have ignored it. Could have let Titan die at the plant. Could have kept working for Sterling without asking questions. Why didn't you? Caleb thinks of the question for a long time. Because there was a child somewhere eating a burger made from an animal that was being poisoned. And I couldn't look at that child and say I didn't know. That I did nothing. That I believed silence was safety. He breathes. Silence isn't safety. Silence is complicity. Silence is you agreeing the system is right by not saying it's wrong. The interview is broadcast. People watch. People understand. People start questioning their own silences. People start talking about corruption they know. People start reporting. A month later, the federal action is expanded. It's not just Sterling investigated. It's the hospital directors who knew the scheme. The antibiotic suppliers who never questioned the absurd dosages. The health inspectors paid not to see. Every piece of the puzzle is dismantled. Not fast, not elegantly. In a slow, meticulous way. In a bureaucratically efficient way. Caleb is called to testify at the trial. He enters a courtroom that is like a stage where a whole man's judgment is played out. Sterling is in the defendant's box. His eyes meet Caleb's. And when they do, there is something in them almost like respect. Because Sterling understands he was beaten by someone he thought was invisible. The prosecution asks Caleb to tell the story. He tells it, from the beginning, from when he was an invisible man working for another man who didn't see him. He tells it until the moment the gavel was struck. He tells it until the moment he understood something was wrong. Simple, honest, undramatized. When he finishes, half the room is in tears. Not because Caleb was dramatically eloquent, but because the simple truth is always more powerful than the sophisticated lie. The defense attorney tries to discredit him, tries to say Caleb is a traitor, someone who stole from his boss, someone who can't be believed. Caleb just looks at the lawyer and says nothing. Because there is nothing to say. Because his truth is standing while the lie is unmasked by its own weight. It's sickening to see a system where the truth has to fight so hard to be believed, isn't it? To see that evil can wear a suit and tie and become respectable. To see that it takes an ordinary man putting his life on the line to expose what should be obvious. If you also believe the truth should be easier to see, that corruption should be easier to punish, leave a like now to support everyone who refuses to be an accomplice of silence. 6 months later, the sentence is read. Sterling is convicted of crimes against public health, convicted of negligent homicide for the people who died from intratreatable infections, convicted of food fraud, convicted of the attempted murder of Caleb. The sentence is 22 years. Sterling doesn't shout, doesn't offer resistance. He is just led away by guards like a man who finally understands the world is bigger than his arrogance. His hospitals are under state receivership. His packing plants are closed. His property is seized. A year later, Caleb returns to the Valley Paradise Ranch, but it's not called that anymore. It's called the Valley Sustainable Cooperative, and it no longer belongs to one man. It belongs to the men who made it work for decades while not being seen. The former employees, those Caleb had sought for help and who had refused out of fear, are now in charge. They are planting organic crops, raising animals humanely, turning a place of death into a place of life. And Caleb is the supervisor, no longer invisible, no longer disrespected, just recognized as someone who knows that land. In the spot where Titan had been hidden, where Caleb had pointed a bolt pistol at the head of a dying animal, there is now a plaque, a simple wooden plaque. It says, "Here a steer taught us that silence is also complicity." People visiting the cooperative stop before the plaque. They read the words. They understand there's more to the story than a dead animal. There's a lesson about choice, about courage, about when it's time to stop being invisible. Caleb passes the plaque every day. He passes and puts his hand on the wood, and every time he touches the wood, he remembers the weight of the pistol. He remembers the animal's fever. He remembers running through the marsh. He remembers everything he lost to do the right thing. And he understands it was worth it. Not because he made money, not because he became famous, but because he can look in the mirror and see a man who said no. Sterling remains in prison, still awaiting appeals, still surrounded by people who know exactly what he did, still being the one beaten by the invisible. Federal investigators keep untangling the scheme. There are more connections, more names, more crimes only now being revealed, because one truth started drawing attention to other truths. Dr. Helena publishes an article in the nation's top scientific journal describing the case. The article is studied in medical schools, studied in ethics courses, studied as an example of when pure greed meets opportunity. Titan is remembered, not because he was a special animal, but because he was the point where an invisible man decided he couldn't stay invisible anymore. Justice was slow. Justice was bureaucratic. Justice was decided not in a moment of adrenaline, but in courtrooms where words were said and documents presented, and the truth was turned into law. But justice came, and it was relentless, because once the truth started being told, nothing could stop it. This story taught us that corruption isn't defeated by heroes. It's defeated by ordinary people who refuse to be accomplices. That silence is a choice, and every choice has a price. That sometimes the right thing is so obvious only those working invisibly can see it. If you believe stories like this, stories of people who refuse to surrender to fear, deserve to be told and shared, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because it's these stories that remind us there are still people willing to bleed for the truth. And as long as there are people like that, there is still hope that evil will be exposed and punished. Not fast, not without a price, but inexorably.